All right, folks, welcome back to part two on our lecture series on the nervous system, and this is our last part. So this isn't only a two-part lecture this week, and from there we're just going to try to apply what we've learned. So last time we talked about the two main branches of the nervous system, as well as the neuron and the function of the neuron. Today, we are going to talk about specific structures within the brain, and then we're going to reinforce those with a sheep brain dissection as well. So I'm going to start with biggest, and we're going to essentially kind of do biggest to smallest, but it doesn't really matter the order that we do these. So the first structure that I want to talk about, and again, I do have a video normally that I share here. It's actually a Brain Games episode from Nat Geo, National Geographic. It's really, really good. I actually think Brain Games is on Netflix, so I recommend that you give it a shot. I think it will help you understand the function of a lot of the structures of our brain a little bit more and how they're intertwined with our sensory system. But today I'm just going to introduce the parts and much broader functions. So the cerebrum, the biggest structure, right? These two halves of our brain. And by the way, for all of these structures, I'm going to show an animated GIF of what it looks like in 3D. Because sometimes I think seeing it from, if I go back here, I think sometimes seeing this mid-sagittal view gives you too much of a two-dimensional image. So we're going to talk about it a little bit more three-dimensionally. So the cerebrum is also known as the telencephalon, and the telencephalon is, again, the largest structure of your brain, and it is the largest for good reason, because it is really what's controlling all of the voluntary actions of your body. Anything that you choose to do is essentially being done there, which means all of those things that you're not choosing to do, like breathing, and the feeling that you have to poop, and being hungry or thirsty, all of that stuff happens below the cerebrum. So the cerebrum controls much higher level, higher order thinking, and we call the rest of your brain the bottom portion, the more primitive stuff, right? That's the stuff that all of the great apes have, and even I don't want to say lower level mammals, because I feel like that's very anthropocentric, right? Putting humans at the center of the universe. But the reason that humans are so smart and that we were able to adapt nature to us rather than adapt ourselves to nature is because of our cerebrum, because of our conscious voluntary control, that our much larger brain, in proportion to the rest of our body size, provides for us. It is also important to know, and you've probably learned this before, that each hemisphere controls the opposite side of your body. So the right side of my brain actually controls the left side of my body. And you may have also heard things like, oh, well, the left hand actually is a little bit more of like the creative side, and the right side the right side of your brain is the creative side, and the left side of your brain is the more analytical side. That's not entirely true. That doesn't really bear out in the science, but it is true that each of us has separate skills that are isolated to different hemispheres. So for some people, it might be that the more creative elements of yourself are firing more on the right side, and so on and so forth, but not always the case. So let me go back here. So that's the cerebrum. So the cerebrum, the biggest portion of the brain that we're going to talk about. Now, the second biggest is this portion right here, which kind of looks like a piece of pink cauliflower. And that's the cerebellum. And that comes from the Latin meaning little brain, because it actually looks kind of like a miniature version of what we just talked about, right? A little tiny cerebrum. And its function is mostly for balance and coordination. But it is also there to help us with hunger. So feelings of hunger can start in the cerebellum. But coordination and balance are really, really key. I remember I used to climb apple trees when I was younger. If I would fall out of that tree, and smack the back of my head on the ground, not only did I get the wind knocked out of me from my chest, but I also, saw stars, those little dots, and that was because I hit, obviously, my occipital lobe of my cerebrum, right up here, but I also hit my cerebellum, which made me kind of lose my balance a bit. The other thing that's since coordination and balance is sort of determined by your cerebellum, it makes sense that muscle action would also be in there as well, because as you start to lose balance and coordination, your muscles need to adjust to that. All right, so that's the cerebellum. Now, after the cerebellum, I'm actually going to move up here. I'm going to start right here in the center of your brain, probably one of the most important structures, and that is the thalamus. Now, the thalamus is quite amazing because I mentioned before how your sensory system has to work in collaboration with your nervous system, right? What's the point in having my eyes and my ears and all these input devices unless I can process those input devices? And as it turns out, your thalamus is that organizational structure. So you notice anything that you see, you taste, you touch, or you hear goes to the thalamus first, right in the center of your brain. And then the thalamus, think of it almost like the USPS, right? It repackages it and it sends it where it needs to go. So all of these things, all of these messages are going to the thalamus, and the thalamus is relaying it to the lobe of the brain that it needs to go to. You'll notice there is one exception, and that is your nose. Smell is the only thing that does not have to get processed by the thalamus first. It goes straight to the frontal lobe because actually olfactory bulbs are attached to your frontal lobe. So smell bypasses the thalamus, but everything else uses the thalamus as a relay station for your sense organs. Okay, so thalamus. Now, right below the thalamus, this like purplish looking section is actually called the hypothalamus. And you might remember that prefix hypo means below. So the word literally means below the thalamus, or you might recall thalamus means inner chamber. So it's below the inner chamber. And the hypothalamus, I always would tell my students to remember Hungry, Hungry, Hippo. I don't know if you guys ever had that game when you were growing up. I also remember Hungry, Hungry, Hypo. So as it turns out, the hypothalamus does indeed recognize when we're hungry. It also recognizes when we're thirsty, and it recognizes when we're tired, and it recognizes when we're angry. So all these really, really, much more primitive things that even you do when you're a baby are all controlled by your hypothalamus. And then finally, it recognizes when you're warm, and it tells you to sweat. I don't know if you notice this animated GIF. Look at the color of his shirt when he starts this conference. This is right after our soccer match. And look at it afterward. This man was being grilled or something. It was very, very warm because his hypothalamus went to town to tell his sweat glands to just coat his shirt in like a pound of sweat. Absolutely disgusting. So that's the hypothalamus. These really, really basic responses to hunger, thirst, fatigue, anger, and body temperature. Now, below that, we're going to get even more and more primitive as we move down. So I'm going to talk about this right here. By the way, all the stuff that's appearing here in green is called the brainstem. But this is the midbrain. I'm going to skip that. I'm going to move instead to the pons. And you'll notice the position of the pons is going to be really, really important to what it does. It's kind of between the cerebellum and the cerebrum, kind of. I know this picture's not perfect, but it's kind of between the cerebellum and the cerebrum. So that's going to help tell us one of its functions. So I'm going to click on that Easter egg looking thing. And the reason I just told you that is because pons comes from the Latin word meaning bridge. And the reason it's called the bridge is because it serves as a bridge between the two biggest structures of your brain, the cerebellum and the cerebrum. And of course, I had that function come in second because I'm an idiot and I don't know how to time my lectures. So it is a relay station between the cerebrum and the cerebellum. That's why it's called the pons or the bridge. The other thing, though, that the pons does is it does control aspects of your arousal and respiration, which is actually also why those are tied together. When people become sexually aroused, typically their breathing rate changes with that. And the reason those things are linked is because they're also linked in the brain. Speaking of which, the pituitary gland. I was gonna go down here to the medulla oblongata next, but I'm actually, since we just talked a bit about arousal, I'm gonna talk a little bit about the pituitary gland because that is also tied in there. The pituitary gland is just particularly active during adolescence. It is about the size of a pea, really two peas, right? Since our brain is bisected down the middle. But its job is to do everything that happens around your time, folks. When you're in adolescence, what are you doing? You're growing probably faster than you ever did, except for when you were a little bitty baby, right? Your blood pressure changes. Women actually start to, they're not producing breast milk, but their mammary glands are ready to produce breast milk if they were to become pregnant. And arousal is also controlled there. And for very obvious reasons, I did not supply a picture, an animated GIF of arousal. Trust me, you don't want to see it. Oh my gosh, I don't know what just happened. I honestly, okay. We were just sitting here doing our lecture and it just crashed on me. All right, I'm gonna try this again, folks. I really don't know what happened. looks like it's still recording. I hope to God this is still recording. All right, take 2. All right, anyway, so that's the pituitary gland. Now, don't mix up the pituitary gland here with this structure, which is actually where the eyeballs connect. That's called the optic chiasm, and we'll see that in our dissection. Maybe I can't get this to work. Right here, there we go. So we'd have the optic nerve here, and the eye is actually found right there. So the optic chiasm is right above the pituitary gland. Actually, right below it here to this structure is the mammary papilla. But we're not going to talk about that today either. I did want to talk about, here, I'm going to erase this actually because we don't need this labeling on there. I did want to talk about the pineal gland. So this little structure right here, which actually is shaped like a pine cone, hence its name. So the pineal gland is named because it's shaped like a tiny pine cone. Is the small structure that we're going to talk about, and its sole function, it only has one function, and that is to regulate your sleeping patterns. So it actually produces a hormone called melatonin, and that hormone, some of you may even take melatonin, maybe you have a hard time sleeping, and so you actually have it prescribed by a doctor. Your doctor hopefully knows what he or she is doing. I usually tell students, try not to take melatonin if you don't have to, because your brain will actually start to produce less and less of it the more you're supplementing, which means essentially you're going to be hooked on melatonin for the rest of your life once you start taking it. But again, trust your doctor. I'm not a doctor. I'm a science teacher. But melatonin does regulate sleeping patterns. The more that your brain produces, the more on a schedule you will be. And then lastly, the last structure I want to talk about is this lowermost structure. And it is the most primitive structure. It's the first structure to develop in the growing human brain. And you'll see why. I mean, this, it literally means middle oblong. You'll notice it's an oblong egg-looking structure. Not as much as, if I go back, like the pons definitely looks like an egg, but it's got like a little bulge here. Kind of looks like almost like an Adam's apple if this is like your throat of your spinal cord. But this medulla oblongata does super basic things like breathing or blood pressure or your heart rate, your ability to poop or to swallow or to puke, right? If a baby can do it, right? A baby can breathe, a baby has blood pressure, right? Has a heartbeat, is pooping and swallowing and puking and all that type of stuff. That's because even in a newborn baby, the medulla oblongata is fully developed and doing all these very, very basic primitive things. So those are the, I think 7, right? The 7 main structures of the brain. We got cerebellum, cerebrum, that's 2. Thalamus and hypothalamus, that makes 4. We got these 2 glands, the pituitary gland and the pineal gland, that's 6, 7, and 8, pons and medulla. So we actually talked about 8 structures today. Those are the 8 structures that I want you to know for lecture. I'm going to go into a little bit other ones when we do the lab, but all right, let us move on then. I'm trying to see, whoops. Actually, let me go back here. I wonder if I can. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is the science of memory, but also to talk a little bit about the peripheral nervous system today, and we're going to be all done. So how are you going to remember all the stuff that I just taught you? How are you going to remember it all? If you're a lot like me, even when I was a teenager, I think most people cram information in for the test, and we do that using our short-term memory. A lot of you probably aren't going to remember all the stuff that we're talking about right now, the stuff that I'm teaching you in this moment as you are listening to me speak. Unless you use it every single day, you're not going to remember it, because we remember what we use. And so we're going to put it in our short-term memory, something that we can access, for the test or for the assessment, but then, we can essentially toss it. And the 2 lobes that help us with short-term memory are our temporal and our parietal lobe. On the other hand, if you want it to be stored in long-term memory, something that you're going to come back to and use over and over again, you need to consolidate those memories using another part of your brain called the hippocampus. So the hippocampus actually helps with storing and consolidating long-term memories. And it stores a lot of those long-term memories actually in your frontal lobe. So they're stored in totally different parts of the brain. It's not to say that just because something is in your temporal lobe or your parietal lobe that you won't be able to remember it long-term. It's just that those are more used for short-term memories. Sorry, my little son here is just saying hello. Bye, Alistair. I love you. He doesn't he doesn't really care if I'm recording something. He's like, I'm gonna bust in and say hi anyway. All right, so oh God, please don't play this video. All right, though I have a little video that I'm not gonna play because again, it's not gonna work. I can't get these videos to work when I do these little lectures. I always get my videos flagged for copyright anyway when I do that, but I do want you to know that we just talked a lot about the brain and how the brain works, and there are many, many, many millions of neurons in your brains, or neurons and nerves inside your brain. But what's absolutely unique about your brain is that your brain feels no pain at all. This video is actually taken from one of the Silence of the Lambs movies, which is a great, like if you're into like serial killer type of villain movies, this one's super good. This movie is actually called Hannibal, and there's a small little scene where Hannibal Lecter, he's a cannibal, he's a psychiatrist, absolutely crazy serial killer guy. He cuts a piece of this FBI agent's brain out and feeds it to him. And when you're watching it, you're like, this is insane. You can't really cut a piece of someone's brain out without them just falling over and blah, blah, blah. But you could. Your brain doesn't feel pain. It's not the point of your brain. Your brain's job is not to sense pain. It's there to process it. So if you were somehow able to open up your skull cap and access your brain, you would not feel a hot knife cutting through your brain, which I know sounds crazy. Now, things would stop working, right? It'd be like your brain, like your computer again. If I go back to the motherboard CPU analogy that I made with part 1 of this series, the CPU is just there to process the input coming from the keyboard and the mouse and all the other parts of the computer, but it doesn't feel anything. On the other hand, if I opened up your computer and I just started, taking like a wrench to the Intel CPU or the AMD CPU, whatever, CPU you have in your computer's still going to stop working. So it's not to say that your brain doesn't respond to damage that's being done to it, but you cannot feel any pain, which is quite amazing because it's not there to sense pain. It's there to process those senses. All right, the last thing for the central nervous system is the spinal cord, and then we're just going to finish up with a little bit of peripheral nervous system, and we're going to be done. So I do want you to know that the spinal cord is absolutely amazing, right? Think of it as like this super highway to your brain, and we got all these nerves that are sending information to your brain. We have to protect it, just like our skull protects our brain. We've got 24 bones and a pelvic girdle that protects our spinal cord. So the vertebral column is really there to protect it. And because we have to be bending and stuff like that, we don't have one solid bone. I've never liked that we use the term backbone to talk about our vertebrae because you have many, many, many bones. Do they move a lot? No, but they allow for some movement so your spinal cord can move there. Now, every now and then your spinal cord, it could pop out, right? There's actually a whole bunch of different disorders that maybe we'll get to in class where a piece of the spinal cord is popping out. That's called spina bifida. But hopefully we're keeping it in those bones, keeping it protected. The function of your spinal cord, for the most part, other than just serving as a superhighway to your brain, is it is there to process reflexes. So you can actually see this reaction that a baby is doing is it's being processed by the spinal cord. So I can't remember the name of that process off the top of my head, but when babies have that jerking reaction while they're sleeping, the brain is not telling the baby to reach out and curl their fingers. The spinal cord is. Oh my gosh, folks, I have no idea what's going on. Microsoft PowerPoint on the iPad must be a total piece of crap because it keeps crashing on me and it's driving me crazy, and I am so sorry about all these interruptions. I promise we're almost done. Look, we only have like 4 slides left. Oh my gosh, I'm going to try this for like the 4th time. I don't know if maybe I just need to update the program. So it's there to process reflexes. Lastly, there are a lot of branches that come off the spinal cord. You can see them here. They branch through these little transverse, there are these little holes in the side of the each vertebrae that allows for nerves to pop off of the spinal cord. And there are actually 31 pairs of nerves that do that. So all right, last thing I want to talk about, hopefully before PowerPoint crashes again, is the peripheral nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system, remember from day 1 of this lecture, is just all of the nerves that are outside of the brain and the spinal cord. You do have 2 divisions of your peripheral nervous system, and I'll throw them both up here. You have something called the sensory or afferent division, and you have another division called the motor or efferent division. So the sensory division, you'll notice they show red in this picture. The sensory division does exactly what it sounds like it does. It senses whatever the stimulus is that is being perceived. So again, I talked about stubbing the toe in the first part of this lecture. So if I stub my toe on the corner of a piece of furniture, the sensory division sends that pain impulse to the central nervous system, and in this instance, just the spinal cord. The spinal cord sends it back and tells me, move your darn foot, right? And that's why it's called the motor division. The motor division is the part of your nervous system that causes you to take action on whatever was sensed. We also call it afferent and efferent for the same reason. We called it afferent and afferent, or afferent and efferent when we talked about the urinary system. Afferent arrives at the central nervous system, and efferent exits the central nervous system. So if you can remember these first two letters, A and E, that might help you remember what they do. And then lastly, the neurons that make up the different divisions are kind of important. Now, what I love about this picture is that the neurons, this blue one, this green one, and this red one, they kind of look like they have eyeballs. Those are the cell bodies. And the nuclei, they kind of like this one particularly to me looks like that one dude from Monsters, Inc. But either way, I tried to color coordinate them. Any neuron that is part of the sensory division is called a sensory or afferent neuron. Pretty easy. Just like the red one is going to be called an efferent neuron or motor neuron. But the one in the middle we haven't talked about yet because it's inside of the central nervous system. So any neuron that's found within the brain or within the spinal cord is called an interneuron. And inter just means between. It's an in-between phase. And then lastly, remember, the red ones are called motor or efferent neurons. So those neurons are just doing different things. Remember, sensory neurons are sending the impulse to the thing to be processed. Motor neurons are saying, hey, move your toe out of the way. You just smashed it on a table. So that is it, folks. I am all done. And of course, here I thought I was going to be able to exit there. I wonder if I can. Here we go. We are done with the lecture for today. I hope this all made sense. As always, if you need me for anything, please reach out. I would be happy to help. But this is going to conclude our lecture series on the nervous system. Take care and stay healthy.